Hello everyone and welcome back to HN1100. Today we're looking at what happens if our negotiation process falls apart. What happens if we cannot reach a settlement and an impasse occurred? Chapter 9 deals with this issue and it's called strikes and lockouts. Strikes and lockouts are common tools that are used in order to ensure that negotiations come to a successful end. It's a very extreme tool. It is used as a blunt instrument because what happens is that the workers need to withdraw their services or the employer physically locks out the workers and keeps them from being employed. Nobody likes strikes and lockouts. However, because of the fact that it is such a blunt instrument, it is ultimately the power that a union holds over a company, and it is ultimately a power that the company holds over the union if negotiations are unsuccessful. So let's take a quick look at Chapter 9. Well, Chapter 9, first of all, we define what a strike is. Well, a strike occurs when members of the bargaining unit withdraw their labor. So effectively, they stop working. A lockout occurs when an employer closes all parts of the workplace so that workers can't enter the premises and perform their jobs. So effectively, it is a reverse strike. The management say, don't come in here because I'm not allowing you to come in until you come across with better negotiations towards a collective agreement. Another form of something that kind of strikes, and if we were to think of a broader category than strikes or lockouts, industrial action is the broadest category, and it includes strikes and lockouts, but it also includes other things that workers and management can do in order to move us along towards agreeing with a collective agreement. Another big issue that when we think about strikes is this issue of what makes a strike legal and what makes a strike illegal. Well, effectively, a legal strike or lockout can take place only while the collective bargaining process is underway, and it only can occur after the collective bargaining process has failed. What this means is that you cannot go on strike during the term of a collective agreement, nor can you be locked out legally. You cannot legally be locked out during the term of a collective agreement. So a strike or lockout occurs because negotiations have effectively broken down. In most Canadian jurisdictions, the employer is prohibited from dismissing striking employees during a strike, so you can't be laid off. Strikes happen with the purpose of inflicting economic pain on the employer. And the party that wins is usually the one that's better able to withstand the economic pain. So there's all kinds of motivations that drive people to strike. And like I say, strike is a blunt instrument, and people do not like going on strike usually. But sometimes people end up on strike, no doubt about it. So what happens for a strike to occur? Well, strikes occur because of a whole bunch of reasons. And, there is a train of thought that strikes happen because of mistake or incompetence sometimes. So, for example, lacking bargaining experience, lacking disclosure of information, if we don't understand the complexity of the issues, if there's miscalculations on one side or another, or changes in the parties' expectations during bargaining, that can lead to a breakdown in negotiations, which in turn could lead to a strike. Strikes are really a collective voice, meaning that everybody goes on strike. When there is a strike, everybody goes out. Union and management have different interests and different philosophies and often distrust one another. Strikes or lockouts occur because workers are dissatisfied, management is not willing to address the discontent, workers need to be able to express their discontent, the union leaders need to be able to mobilize the discontent, they got to be socially legitimate. Sometimes, for example, strikes are not socially legitimate. Teachers, for example, have a very hard time going on strike because it's very hard to lock children out of schools and deny them an education. Strikes and lockouts occur because the party wants to express its concerns visibly. So a strike is very much a very publicity type thing. You need to be able to get people out and to show people that they are out. Another factor that comes into whether or not we should strike is looking at the issue of bargaining structure, how much power one has. Size of the bargaining unit, Larger units are more likely to strike than smaller units, because the workers involved in a larger bargaining unit, the the strike will have a much bigger impact if there's a lot of people going as opposed to a few. So, size of the bargaining unit makes a big difference. And bargaining units tend to be small, though, and these tend not to have nearly as many strikes. There's also individual factors that come into play with regards to going on strike. Loyal union members are probably more likely to strike. The nature and quality of the past relationship is going to affect the ability to strike. Or whether strikes worked before. If they worked before, they might work again. So if that approach is often there. Unions and management also look at other factors external to the organization when they consider a strike, or the possibility of a strike really depends on things like economic conditions. If the economy is doing really well and that labor is in a very good position to kind of muscle for improvements in working conditions, a strike is more likely. If economic conditions are poor, strike is less likely. Nobody wants to go on strike, and not a lot of people are going to be sympathetic. People want a union boosted raise if everyone else is in pain. There's also legislative restrictions. Government, for example, can deem a strike. Government can effectively force employees back to work. So there could be legal preconditions. Some businesses, some government, for example, business is not allowed to go on strike. RCMP, for example. Or in the case of the post office, as I record this, the post office is busy, trying to get a new collective agreement. They've done some rotating strikes. Well, on this day that I'm recording this, the federal government has just announced that they have put back to work legislation in place to make a legal strike illegal. So that has a big issue. So in order to go on strike, then, what we need to do is to be able to figure out, what do the rules say with regards to strike? Well, strike or lockouts can only begin after certain preconditions are met. First of all, a legal strike or lockout can either occur only during the collective bargaining process and when the existing collective agreement has expired. So two of those rules need to be met. The legal strike has to be voted on. In other words, it has to be authorized by a secret ballot strike vote by the members of the bargaining unit. And a majority, 50% plus 1, must be required before there is a strike mandate. Most jurisdictions require 2/3 intervention before a strike or lockout. How does a strike or lockout begin? Well, the parties undertake a strike or lockout must give notice to the other party that there's going to be a strike or a lockout. Most jurisdictions have legislation that restricts or forbids strikes by essential services workers, as is in the case of most public service unions. So an essential service withdrawal would cease and be treated as a public safety issue, and they'd be ordered back to work. And government can use back to work legislation. Striking workers must seek other employment in order. The other thing that is important for a strike is that the conciliation process has to have occurred. So essentially, what we're looking at is, before we can go on strike, the contract negotiations must be underway, the contract must be up, and a conciliator is a third party that's brought in, must have submitted his or her report. In Newfoundland, that report has to be submitted 2 weeks. So if, for example, today the conciliator is about to bring down the report, that means a strike could not begin until 2 weeks after. Once a strike is in place, two major things that occur is this publicity campaign. One of the biggest publicity campaigns is the picket line. The picket line is a very visible demonstration of the fact that a strike is happening. Sometimes an employer will attempt to use replacement workers, and in jurisdictions like Newfoundland, it's allowed. Unions do not like replacement workers and will do everything they can to make their lives very difficult. So picketing is Picketing is, as I say, the big tool. Sometimes picketing works, sometimes it doesn't. What workers often do is they bring in secondary picketing. So, for example, they go to suppliers and start to picket those, or to picket the homes of the management. That runs into a gray area, and sometimes those things are brought to court, and the court will determine no, you're not allowed to do that. Picketing must be in compliance with the law. The law will lay out what you can do in order to picket it. Sometimes it goes to court, and the court will determine how much picketing is allowed. You can't really cross the picket line as a union member unless you're under contract. Union members may choose to cross their own picket line or the picket line of a striking union. However, if they do, they will face repercussions from the union, and that could include being kicked out of the union, which could mean a closed shop, that they have no job anymore. So with that, then that outlines the strike. Now, all strikes come to an end. So what happens for a strike to come to an end? Well, strikes are, as I say, a very heavy hammer in order to bring negotiations to a head. At all times, the strike will end. Negotiations will continue, and a settlement will be reached. The question is timing. How long will it take to do that? So a strike or lockout can end when whoever it is that is in control of it, the union in the case of a strike, and the management in the case of a lockout, decides to end it. So the parties go back to the bargaining table usually and agree to end the strike, or they may go back to the bargaining table and the strike would continue. But effectively, once a collective agreement is reached, once a tentative agreement is reached, then the strike will end. And a strike is expensive. A union has to pay the workers some sort of strike pay, which is nothing near their normal rate of pay. So the strikers are hurting because they're not getting paid. Management is hurting because they're not producing anything. So as a result, there's a lot of pressure on strikers and the employer to end the strike as quickly as possible. So with all that, then I think that covers the major items. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.